As a green building company, we only buy Forest Stewardship Council or FSC certified lumber. FSC is the highest rated and most respected certification company in the world that certifies forests for sustainable harvesting. Now, what does that mean? Well, in a minute, we're going to talk about FSC certified, and we're also going to talk about something called greenwashing, or the ability of a company to talk about the benefits of their product without talking about the negative aspects of their product, or to make themselves seem more green than they really are. Interested in learning more? Let's get into it. Now, companies that are trying to sell you something are going to try to make their product seem better than anybody else's product. They're going to build up the positives and ignore the negatives. But sometimes even that is not enough. As you'll see in the advertisement here, maybe we have a burger that looks really, really good in the model and in the advertisements. When you go to actually buy it from a restaurant, maybe it doesn't look so good. Or a cereal which talks about helping support childhood immunity and offer antioxidants and nutrients, but in fact maybe doesn't actually do any of those. Now, a company knows that if they say something over and over and over again, you're going to start to believe it. We see it in politics. We even see it from some of our history's most notorious characters. Now, what does that mean? Well, why are they doing that? Well, obviously, you want to make yourself appear or your product appear as good as possible. So here we're looking at the advertisement for a certified forest. So certification in forestry is supposed to suggest that that forest is harvested in such a way that that forest will become a forest and will stay a forest even after it's harvested. We'll see here, this is an advertisement I took off of an online corporation. But in fact, when you look at different certifications for forestries, we see a very, very different picture. This is a picture from space. And we see that this certification, which is Forest Stewardship Council certification, versus SFI, or Sustainable Forestry Initiative certified forests, look very different from space than they do, than you would assume based on their names. And in fact, this is a Forest Stewardship Council certified forest. And it looks pretty much like a forest. And here's another Forest Stewardship Council certified forest. And here is the Sustainable Forestry Initiative with this beautiful forest around this babbling brook. It looks absolutely spectacular. But is the reality the same as the situation that they would have you believe on their website? Well, this is an SFI certified forest. It doesn't look anything like a real forest. In fact, we can see the forest in the back, but in the foreground, what we really see is a bog and what looks like a bomb site. Well, why are companies doing that? Well, Forest Stewardship Council is a certification system that's an international certification brought about by a bunch of different organizations, environmental organizations, that wanted a way to make sure that people could buy lumber in a responsible way from companies or organizations that were selling that lumber, but had abided by a certain level of responsibility. SFI, or the Sustainable Forestry Initiative, was actually sponsored by, and is currently sponsored by, a bunch of forestry companies and a bunch of paper companies. So they actually have developed a logo that looks very much like that Forest Stewardship Council logo. Why do they do that? It's to confuse you. When we look at the differences between the SFI and the FSC, we see that this is from the Sustainable Forestry Initiative, that they're trying to make you think that they're all the same, that all the standards that are common in Forest Stewardship Council are also common in Sustainable Forestry Initiative. But what we see is that that's not actually the same. If you were to go through and read all this, they're highlighting all the aspects of the Sustainable Forestry Initiative that sound like the same responsibility and the same ethics that we find in the Forest Stewardship Council. But in fact, if we look at the two, they're very, very different. The Forest Stewardship Council was sponsored by, and was originally created in 1992 by the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, while as the SFI was sponsored by the paper and pulp industry in 1994, just 2 years after the FSC, in response to the FSC. The FSC is developed by representatives from environmental, social, and forest management groups, whereas the SFI was based on principles supported by the paper and pulp industry. The FSC is based on 10 principles, each of which is followed by a list of criteria, compliance and criteria as gauged by specific rules. The SFI has some auditing capacities as well, but they're voluntary and they're not mandated. And in fact, if you want a FSC certified lumber, you have to track where that lumber was harvested, and it has to have a tag that goes all the way through it, through the transportation, through the milling, and to the final product. Under the SFI, none of that is the case. A piece of lumber can come from an SFI certified forest, or it cannot come from a forest certified by SFI. It is adopted by volunteering to say you're going to abide by these circumstances, but it actually doesn't abide by those rules. FSC is internationally recognized. SFI is only North America, and again, it's voluntary. If we look at the development of these two different certification systems and we compare them, the SFI, again, by the American paper and pulp industry, they have no minimum standards, no worker or indigenous person standards, voluntary requirements, no required third-party inspections, old growth timber harvesting is okay. They have no social elements to their forestry practices, no biodiversity elements, no long-term valuation. So once that forest is harvested, it doesn't have to have any value after it's been harvested. And none of the materials that are labeled have to be from certified forests. Whereas the FSC has compliance with laws and FSC principles as one of its first tenure. You have to have and consider the rights and responsibilities of the people who lived in that forest long before the forestry service was there or the lumber was harvested. We have to have community interaction, and we have to talk about workers' rights and implement workers' considerations. The forest has to be a forest before it was harvested and after it was harvested. There has to be a defined environmental impact on that forest, and that has to meet the standards of the FSC. It has to be managed. So the typical FSC certified forest can be harvested for that same amount of lumber every 17 years. That means that that's a forest before it was harvested, and it's a forest after it was harvested. And that same amount of lumber that was taken out can be harvested again and again and again in perpetuity. So it stays a forest, and you can continue to use it. The previous pictures suggest that you can't actually harvest lumber from that essentially bomb crater. And lastly, we have to make sure that the forest has value to the people who live in that area, that it is still a forest and it still functions for fishing or hunting or whatever various uses the occupants of that land used before. If you go into a forest near a town, that town has to be able to use that forest afterwards. Now, why does a company who is trying to sell you forestry products want to suggest that they're the same as the FSC? Because for people like me who only buy certified lumber, that's important. So when you go to a big box store or a lumber yard and you see two pieces of lumber, one FSC certified and one SFI certified, they look the same, and you're probably going to buy whatever's cheaper. But maybe you wouldn't if you knew the real truth behind those two materials, and you knew that the FSC certified lumber was actually a higher level of sustainability, of responsibility to the environment, and responsibility to the people who live in the forests around you. So if you're interested in learning more about spending your money wisely, about supporting sustainable practices, whether forestry practices or other practices, please hit subscribe as we show you how to build and buy a better way.